We're going to ask a member of the president's cabinet next and later. And about face from Facebook, the Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Secretary Buttigieg, good morning to you. Thanks for being back on the show.
Morning. Good to be with you again.
So lots of topics to get you on this morning. And let me start here with what we just left off related to these cyber attacks against the United States. What should the red line be for the U.S. to, in essence, retaliate and perhaps launch some kind of cyber counteroffensive?
Well, I'll let others speak to military capabilities and doctrine. We've had for over a decade cyber command managing our defense capabilities. Meanwhile, you have the Department of Homeland Security doing a lot of work in partnership with law enforcement to make sure that our infrastructure is secure. And then, of course, there's the piece that the Department of Transportation has, which has traditionally been to make sure that our infrastructure is safe. Now it's increasingly clear that includes not just the physical means of safety that we've thought about for years, but making sure that we have resilient infrastructure in the face of mounting cyber threats. I think you're going to see us raise the bar in terms of our expectations as we work with state and local partners, as we work with private sector partners to make sure that we have harder targets for these kinds of cyber threats, because it turns out, having a crack in your cybersecurity can be just as damaging to this country as a physical crack in a piece of steel like what I saw in Memphis at the I-40 bridge yesterday.
I want to pick up on something you just mentioned. You talked about having potentially harder targets and the idea of resiliency. So let's get into this idea of resiliency as it relates to infrastructure under your purview here. At this point, private companies, and I know the executive order discusses this as it relates to contractors, but other companies are not required to tell you when something has happened, right? Does that need to change, and will it? Do you think that is a critical step that will be useful as you look to, as you say, harden up the infrastructure?
Yeah, it's clear right now that we don't have all of the tools that are going to be needed as the years go forward and these cyber threats grow in their number and their complexity. It's not just in terms of being able to get information, but also when you think about things like disaster declarations and the way we respond to emergencies. A lot of the law was written in a time when nobody was thinking about even the concept of cyber threats. They're about natural disasters and they're about physical attacks. And this is something different, but also, as we've seen, just as disruptive. So I think it's going to be very important for Congress and the administration to work together to find ways to shore up information sharing, to shore up security. And as your question points out, look, a lot of the critical infrastructure in this country is in private hands, or it's in the hands of local government units, sometimes quite small, that don't have that much capacity. But what we're learning is that every organization needs to be thinking about cyber. This is not something you tuck away in the IT department. Right. Any business, any government needs to be competent at cybersecurity.
So given that, quickly, would you then support a requirement that mandates companies tell the feds when something like this has happened?
So, as you know, in certain cases, the president's executive order has already been able to improve our ability to get information. But we are going to need to work with Congress to get the other kinds of capabilities that we need. It's a major policy challenge ahead.
I wonder, Mr. Secretary, do you consider attacks that are significant against, let's say, critical resources, food, fuel, the country's transportation system? Do you consider those acts of war?
Well, look, every case is different, and, a decision like that and a determination like that is something that comes from the White House, not the Department of Transportation. But what I'll say is that, there's a lot to do with safety and there's a lot to do with security at stake in our cyber strength. The Colonial Pipeline hack was just one example that reveals how much we have on the line. And we've got a lot of work to do as a country.
I want to turn to infrastructure before we go live to President Biden, who will be making remarks in Delaware in, I think, just under 2 minutes from now. But very quickly, have you been in touch with either of the transportation systems that have made news this week for being disrupted, the MTA or the ferry system up in Massachusetts?
So our department's in regular contact with all transit agencies and making sure they get the support that they need. And it's, again, yet another example of the concerns that are out there. Look, it's a good thing that these agencies are not necessarily owned and operated by the federal government, but we've got to do everything we can as an agency to help them.
We know that on Capitol Hill, we've been reporting on this morning. One of my colleagues interviewed Senator Joe Manchin as it relates to the infrastructure discussions that are happening. I know you said this weekend that you are looking at, I think, Monday, right, June 7th, as when you'd like to see some real movement now from Republicans. And there is this sort of implication that otherwise Democrats will go it alone. Oh, Secretary Buttigieg, I've got to thank you here as we see President Biden now speaking on the economy. Thanks. Sure, it was a quicker 2 minutes than we expected to the president's remarks. Thank you for rejoining us.
Thanks for having me back, and I'm glad I was able to be with you during those remarks. It reminds me why I love working for this president. He's so focused on what's actually working for the American people, looked America in the eye, talked about why the plan is working, vaccines up, cases down, unemployment down, business confidence up, but acknowledging we have a long way to go and a lot of work ahead, which is why things like the American Jobs Plan matter so much.
One of the things, I don't know if you caught it at the end, reporters in the room shouted out, as they are wont to do, a couple of questions about the infrastructure discussions that he is having today with the West Virginia senator who has been tasked with leading the Republican negotiations here. And I want to talk with you about that. This is obviously within your purview. When you look at where the movement is right now, there does not seem to be too much of it, right? You've got progressives, in the words of Politico, losing their minds over President Biden waiting to get some kind of a deal with Republicans. On the other side of things, you've got Senator Joe Manchin, who is making very clear with NBC News this morning, he's not down to go it alone. He wants Republican support. So if, in fact, this June 7th deadline, if you will, comes and goes and Republicans aren't where Democrats want them to be, explain to me where the math is. How do Democrats go it alone if Joe Manchin is not on board and not willing to do it without Republicans?
Well, look, it's not just one senator who wants a bipartisan approach. So does the president. I think we all do. And we're going to do what we can to get there. Some movement, which we've seen, is definitely better than no movement. But there's also a ways to go. And like everybody else, I'll be eager to see the results of the president's conversation with Senator Capito today. As we move into next week, we're seeing a lot of movement happening in the House, where the Transportation Committee will take up its bill on Wednesday. And we're going to continue to see these conversations. But conversations can't go on forever. I think that there's a lot of impatience. It's not just a press thing or an insider thing. There's a lot of public impatience to get something done. And we feel that because everywhere I go, I see pieces of infrastructure that are in dire need of repair or improvement. And I see communities that can't wait for what they might be able to do if we brought together the resources for them to move forward. So, we continue to be hopeful about where these talks can get us. But the sense of urgency is mounting on our part as well. And you're going to see that shape, I think, our decisions and approaches in the weeks ahead.
You said that you are willing, that the administration is willing to do what we can to get there, right? And I wonder if that means giving, since you talk about wanting a bipartisan deal, giving Republicans more time than, let's say, next week to try to get closer to the proposal that you are putting on the table. At what point does the patience run out, Secretary Buttigieg?
Well, there's got to be forward motion of the ball. We can't just be sitting still and we can't be talking past each other. But I think like I said, there really has been motion.
If there is, then, would you be willing to stretch these talks into, let's say, July, if you feel like you are perceiving some forward movement of the ball?
Well, look, we clearly have to deliver this summer. I think that's understood, not just as a Washington thing, but among the American people. And it takes a while, of course, to move a fully negotiated bill through Congress just as a matter of procedure. There's movement. There's going to be more important movement next week as the House takes up its version of the surface bill, which is a very important piece of legislation that touches our jobs plan in a number of different ways. But we can't allow this to drag on forever, and we can't allow inaction to be the result. The president's been very clear. He doesn't have a lot of red lines. He's willing to at least hear out all kinds of different ideas. But one red line he put out there, loud and clear, is that inaction is unacceptable.
You have talked at length about the importance of some of the things that are in this proposal, in this infrastructure plan. But I have to ask you, is there any planet on any universe in which the administration would perhaps drop some of the non-traditional infrastructure-related items as Republicans have been asking for, and do that deal with the GOP for now, this summer, given the urgency you're talking about, and then perhaps try to address the other stuff down the road?
Well, look, there are some things that are going to be easier to come to agreement on than others. That's one of the reasons why you saw movement to the tune of $500 billion in the counteroffer the president put forward earlier. And, a lot of that is by saying, OK, let's at least agree that we can move on these things. But let's be very clear. There is a great American tradition of expanding our visions around infrastructure. Trains weren't traditional until we actually built them. Same thing for the interstate highway system. And the president believes very strongly that every American ought to have internet access, that getting lead out of the pipes that carry water to our children is imperative. And, if you look at our competitors, you look at the investments that China is making, they're not wringing their hands over philosophical disputes on different categories of spending. They're doing what it takes to stay competitive, and the president's determined that America does what it takes to win the future.
Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, you have been very generous with your time this morning, covering a lot of ground with us in this bifurcated interview. Thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us. We hope to have you back.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Turning now to a big